Thank you for coming. I am presenting my grand rounds presentation on an idea called emotion prosthetics, which I've been working on with Dr. Greg Siegle and the Pecan Lab over the last 4.5 years, actually since I was a fourth-year med student. And we are working on developing technology that uses minimally and non-invasive alternatives to treat mental illness. So before we start, I just want to disclose that I am the co-inventor on a patent on this technology. Following the analysis of the study that I'm presenting here, my wife, Catherine Fantazzi, decided that after reviewing the study results and seeing the promise that she would quit her job and start a translational neuroscience startup called Apollo Neuroscience Inc., which is now moving forward with the commercialization of this technology. So the learning objectives today that I hope will be passed on from my presentation are to understand the relationships between autonomic nervous system activity and the stress response, and to understand the way in which sensory stimuli, including vibration, can predictably alter autonomic nervous system activity, and to recognize opportunities for minimally and non-invasive treatment options prior to initiation of pharmacological approaches primarily for anxiety-related disorders. This is basic outline that we're going to go through. We're going to talk about introduction, background, and theory that is all of this work is based on. We're going to talk about the study hypotheses, methods, and results, and then a discussion of future directions and next steps, and then questions and discussion. So,
can you move the microphone from your collar to your jacket?
Absolutely.
It's rubbing against your jacket at the moment.
Thank you. This is loud. Turn this down.
That's it.
All right. Is that okay? Sorry about that. So, interestingly, we chose PTSD because PTSD has been characterized over many years as a disorder of autonomic nervous system dysregulation. Interestingly, the NIMH was founded to develop novel treatments for PTSD in 1949. Currently, to date, there are only 2 FDA-approved medications for PTSD, and those are sertraline and paroxetine. And with those medications, unfortunately, the clinical remission rates are under 30%. And in the last 15 years, surprisingly, there have not been any new FDA-approved treatments for PTSD. Interestingly, PTSD is also the highest cost of treatment for the VA right now at over $40 billion, and that's just with a year, which is just the people who are diagnosed with PTSD. It's expected by VA researchers that number is actually underreported by up to 50%, and there's also estimated at 1 suicide per hour from a military veteran who has PTSD, so this is a very pressing issue for us. So in the background on this is that psychopathology, particularly of affective disorders like PTSD, anxiety, and major depression, are characterized by increased stress and ineffective coping strategies. And these have correlates in the body, and we see these commonly in clinical symptoms like mood, anxiety, sleep, and activity levels. We also see this in autonomic dysregulation. Folks with these illnesses tend to, especially PTSD, tend to have low heart rate variability. And low heart rate variability is a measure of parasympathetic tone. That's also a measure of the body's ability to adapt to changing stress in the environment. And it is the change in time between individual heartbeats, distinct from heart rate. And this has been found to be one of the key predictors of PTSD outcome and also outcome from mental illness. Folks with low heart rate variability tend to have an increased risk of illness, physical and mental. Galvanic skin response is another measure, which is a fancy way of saying electrodermal activity or sweat. It's a sign of sympathetic activity, and then respirations are another autonomic focus. And then neural correlates that we look at often in our EEG and Pupil. And because we're focusing a lot on autonomic nervous system, I want to elaborate on that a little bit. So sympathetic and parasympathetic systems are often in balance with one another and regulate sympathetic system being fight or flight and the stress response, and parasympathetic system being rest, digest, relaxation, reproduction, creativity, all the things that we do that make our lives better when we're not stressed out. So interestingly, as I said earlier, heart rate variability is a change in the interval between heartbeats. Low heart rate variability predisposes to physical and mental illness. High heart rate variability predisposes to enhanced cognitive and physical resilience and performance. Galvanic skin response or sweat increases correlate with increased sympathetic tone. And respirations, which are also very interesting, are affect the balance of the autonomic nervous system as well. So shallow, rapid breathing correlates with sympathetic tone. So when you're stressed out or you're running from a bear, that's your breaths change to be more shallow and more rapid. When you are, and also if you start breathing shallow and breathing rapidly, you will increase your sympathetic tone and you will decrease parasympathetic tone. Conversely, if you slow your breathing and you take deeper respirations, you will increase parasympathetic tone. And other situations that increase parasympathetic tone, like safety, positive affective stimuli, will also correlate with slow, deep breathing. So some of the strategies that I mentioned already that actually address these features of stress with a focus on the parasympathetic nervous system, because the parasympathetic system is critical for regulating attention, emotion regulation, and the way that we deal with stress, decision making, and a lot of these other things, are biofeedback, deep breathing, meditation, float and sensory deprivation tanks, yoga, sensual limbic touch, sound, and vagal nerve stimulation. All of these techniques over some of them more recently, but others, for example, yoga and meditation, deep breathing, over thousands of years have shown to now be confirmed to boost parasympathetic activity reliably. So interestingly, this talk is on transcutaneous stimulation, so stimulating the skin to change the autonomic nervous system and change some of these clinical features of stress and the way we deal with stress. So what's the evidence for that? And when we reviewed the literature extensively, what we found is that slower oscillations of either electricity or vibration or sensory stimuli in general trend toward increasing parasympathetic tone. So again, think about deep, slow breathing, increases parasympathetic tone. So does slow stimulation to the body overall, and faster oscillations, faster stimuli, fast breathing tend to increase sympathetic tone and suppress parasympathetic tone. So we thought, what would happen if we combined some of these stimuli through the skin? So some of the evidence of why vibration might help with stress. A number of papers have been published over the years showing that slow whole body vibration is associated with increased ratings of pleasantness and increased parasympathetic tone. Massage and other forms of touch increase vagal tone. Heightened vagal tone correlates with improved attentiveness and emotion regulation. And tactile stimulation can influence hypothalamic regulation of the ANS, the autonomic nervous system activity, and associated emotional regulation. So just as a brief review, many of you going back to grad school, med school are familiar with these tracks. On the left is the standard lateral cortical spinal tract, which shows how we receive sensations through the anterior lateral system going through the brainstem to the somatosensory cortex here. But what I wanted to highlight about this mostly is something that we didn't really learn, at least I didn't learn in med school, which was that there's another tract called lamina 1, which is represented on the far right here. And lamina 1, similar to the gustatory and general visceral sensations in the middle pathway, all synapse at the insulate cortex in the limbic system in the brain. And what's interesting is, especially lamina 1 on the right, is a pathway that also has sympathetic nervous system feedback through the spinal cord and synapses with homeostatic parasympathetic controlled regions in the brainstem. And additionally, the insulate cortex, represented up here on the right, also has some attribution to regulation of autonomic nervous system activity. So that became an interesting point of focus for us. So some of the vibration pathways that could exist that affect, that show how vibration could have the impact that we were expecting from this work were started at the bottom. From the bottom up, we look at how vibration affects the body, starting with the receptors in the skin or subdermal. So we know that vibration has substantial evidence for affecting vagal afferent fibers, as well as the DCML, which is a sensory thought to be not necessarily emotion related. And then Pacinian corpuscles, Meissner's corpuscles are all and Merkel cells are all sensitive to changes in tactile sensation of different varieties and frequencies and intensities. And then CT fibers are the small afferent unmyelinated fibers that transmit slow sensory stimuli and are and these synapse, these two on the right synapse with lamina 1 in the spinal cord, which is a second order neuron. So moving up from there, we see that lamina 1, which is kind of at the center here, actually has direct sympathetic connections within the spinal cord to the ANS and affect and target the sympathetic component of in the thoracic cord, and that affects respirations, heart rate, baroreceptor sensitivity, inflammation, and is capable of inducing something called Meyer waves, which are these slow oscillations that can regulate sympathetic tone. And then lamina 1 goes up, synapses up into the medulla and also into the solitary nucleus. And the solitary nucleus is a hub for the autonomic nervous system in the brainstem, which is very interesting. And we also see that lamina 1 synapses in the thalamus. And most importantly of all of this junk up here is that we see a sympathetic component here, and this over here, the NTS, the parabrachial, these are all the parasympathetic, getting into the parasympathetic regulators, which ultimately synapse at the hypothalamus, being the core of autonomic control in the brain. And we also see that going up from the thalamus, sensory stimuli that come in from lamina 1, from all of these different first order sensory fibers, afferent fibers, go up from the posterior ventromedial nucleus and the basal ventromedial nucleus up to the mid-posterior dorsal insula, and then to the anterior insula, and then have a number of, these green arrows are two-way connectivity. So that's showing that whatever is talking to something with the green arrow is also talking directly back. And what we know from the literature is that there is an enormous amount of connectivity going up into the anterior insula and also to parasympathetic regions of the brain and the hypothalamus, and then up ultimately into the amygdala, the OFC, orbitofrontal cortex, the prefrontal cortex, and the ACC. And all of these are very, very important for regulating the autonomic responses to threatening and safe stimuli. So what we're going to focus on here in terms of mechanistic pathways was lamina 1, because lamina 1 served as a sort of central pathway that for emotional stimuli, and also has an enormous amount of evidence that targets of lamina 1 can affect autonomic nervous system regulation, can affect as well as decision making, emotion regulation, and sort of the response, breathing, heart rate variability, and the response as well to positive and negative affective stimuli. So our hypotheses that we developed from this theory were that transcutaneous vibroacoustic stimulation, which is what we're calling the specific layered vibration frequencies that we use in this study, will decrease subjective signs of stress, will increase performance under stress, will increase parasympathetic nervous system tone as measured by heart rate variability, will decrease sympathetic nervous system tone as measured by galvanic skin response, and will increase central indices of effort. So this study that we ran included 38 healthy subjects, and we started by calibrating a physiological assessment so that all our equipment was calibrated to each individual. And then we also calibrated subjective and physiologic reactions to a battery of different frequencies, which I'll show you in a minute. And then we ran folks through this task called a PACEAT. PACEAT is a Paced Auditory Serial Attention task, which many of you probably haven't heard of, but it's a task that is given to astronauts to test their response to futility before they go into space, so that they don't rip the bathroom door off the shuttle when it doesn't open. And so what this task is an interesting task because it engenders futility. So futility by nature is this response of I'm continually putting in more and more effort into a task, but my performance is declining. And that is inherently frustrating to anyone. And we see that in ourselves in our day-to-day lives when we are faced with futile issues or problems that don't have an easy answer, that we just feel like we're just running through the hamster wheel. So this task is excellent at recapitulating these feelings, because what it does is it gives you, in Greg's voice, single-digit numbers 2, 4, 6, 7. Every 2 seconds you hear another single digit number, and your job as a subject is to click on the sum of the last 2 numbers you heard, which is objectively a relatively straightforward and easy task, even for somebody who's bad at math. But what happens is after about a minute, minute and a half of doing this task, which lasts 3 minutes, which is folks are performing after about a minute and a half at about 70 to 85%, and then after about a minute and a half, their performance starts to decline because they start to have negative intrusive thoughts like, why the hell did I sign up for this? Or how much longer is this going to last? What am I doing for dinner? And every single one of those thoughts that comes into their head during the task pulls their focus away from the task at hand, their performance declines, and they start to have this futility response. So most importantly about this task is that we really wanted to prove to ourselves that these vibrations could affect the body, and we wanted to do it in such a way that we could tell that they were having an effect without biasing the subjects. And so all the subjects who were in the study were randomized to me and to them, and I was blinded and they were blinded. So everybody received 6 conditions. One was a no vibration condition. One condition was what we called an inactive control condition, which was like a tapping, more like feel like a tapping that was very low intensity. And then there were some higher frequency conditions that were twofold, that were supposed to improve wakefulness, but we didn't know if they would improve performance. And then we had the 2 frequencies that were these layered, what we called Transcutaneous Vibroacoustic Stimulation, or TVS frequencies, that we made in the lab based on the literature, that we thought would boost parasympathetic tone and have the effect on performance that we hypothesized. And nobody knew what frequency they were getting at the time. I didn't know what frequency anybody was getting at the time, and nobody knew what effect they were supposed to have. So the overall effects that we saw from the study, which were, and these are the specific 2 TVS frequencies compared to the other frequencies, were that with these 2 layered frequencies in particular, we saw significant changes in stress, performance, HRV, heart rate variability, and the use of cognitive resources. Z-score is on the y-axis, which is standard deviations from the mean, which is at 0. So interestingly, we saw these features would cluster together in our results, which were that subjects who had these TVS frequencies would, many of the subjects showed a decreased stress response, which is this is a subjective stress response measured by VAS scale, which is like a 1 to 5, how are you feeling on a bunch of different motion categories, and then and that was assessed before and after each block, and then performance measured by accuracy on the task, HRV is measured by EKG, and then cognitive resources measured by pupil dilation. And what we found is that HRV in particular increased over 1.5 standard deviations from the mean in a large number of subjects, and in these subjects, that when HRV increased, we also saw these other features co-occurring. And I can get more into that in this slide, where we did a principal component analysis where we looked at how do these features cluster together, because everybody's different and everybody responds to different frequencies. So what are we actually seeing? And what was really interesting is we saw that it wasn't that one particular feature changed in person and then the other features didn't, it's that we saw features cluster together repeatedly. And the features that we saw cluster together most commonly were these regulatory controls, what we labeled this group. This is the first group on the left. And this group of folks typically had higher performance on the task, lower stress during the task, lower objective stress, so they sweat less during a task, which suggests that their sympathetic nervous system is less active, and then a higher HRV during the task, which suggests that their parasympathetic system is more active during the task. And so folks who did better on the task significantly had typically these 3 features, which would correlate with our hypotheses. And then this other group was sort of the stimulus distress group, which we labeled because they seemed like they didn't really enjoy the vibratory stimulation very much, because during the calibration, they had low valence, they had high arousal during calibration, they had high GSR, and they had low HRV, low parasympathetic tone during the task, and their GSR, their sign of sympathetic tone during the task went up in response compared to the other group, which went down. And they had no significant change on their PASAT score. So the way these cluster was interesting, because when you compare regulatory control one group, that the regulatory control group on the y-axis, on the x-axis, and the stimulus distress group on the x-axis, what we see are that the groups that had these TVS frequencies that we made in the lab actually cluster together. So F1 was one frequency and F2 was another frequency, and we found that these are significantly different from the inactive control. The inactive control was actually very pleasurable. It decreased distress, but it didn't actually improve performance at all. And it didn't improve regulatory control. So what we see with these frequencies is that the stimulus distress was a little bit elevated, but their ability to regulate their performance, their emotions during the task was actually higher, and they, after the task, reported less stress. So this is just I won't spend too much time on this, but this was particularly interesting because we tested during our calibration a ton of different frequencies. We wanted to see if we give you a battery of waveforms that we create in the lab based on the theory that we discussed earlier, what are people going to report subjectively, and what effect is that going to have on physiology, heart rate variability on the y-axis and galvanic skin response or sweat on the x-axis. And what we found, most interestingly, is that different frequencies have predictably different effects, and these are the means in heart rate variability and galvanic skin response across all subjects, and that these tend to cluster, but they also just are spread out around this graph. So there were many folks who there were folks who experienced these reliably as increasing arousal or increasing sympathetic tone, but decreasing heart rate variability, and then there were these folks that had some frequencies that increased heart rate variability and didn't really have any change to galvanic skin response. And so it was interesting to see this sort of profile which had subjective and objective correlates. We could effectively move people around the spectrum of sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system activity. So then what we did was a linear regression looking at heart rate variability change in figure A on the left, and performance accuracy on the right. On the x-axis, and what we found is that when you look at performance and you look at HRV, as HRV went up with the stimulation, with frequency 1, for instance, performance went up. And we were able to reliably induce this trend with subjects, and similarly with frequency 2, as subjective stress, which is here on the y-axis, as subjective stress declines, going down here, performance increases. So both heart rate variability and subjective stress correlate with increased performance on the task, and both of those states were induced by these two TVS frequencies that we made in the lab. Oops. And lastly, one of those interesting findings that we had was this analysis of pupillometry, which is an assessment, and pupil dilation, which has been a validated metric for cognitive effort. And what was very interesting was we wanted to see, and this is that regulatory control group again, which is the folks who had higher HRV, higher performance, lower GSR, and lower subjective stress. And what we saw was that as pupil dilation increased over time, with frequency 2, for instance here, that regulatory control went up. So effectively what this is showing is that we're in some ways reversing that futility response I talked about earlier. The futility response, again, being I'm continually putting more and more effort into this task and my performance is declining. Now what we're showing is when you give somebody frequency 2 through a wrist delivery or a chest delivery. Oh, I forgot to mention that. We actually did the study on wrist and chest stimulation to compare the difference, and they were relatively similar. But when you give people that stimulation, what we find is that the more brain activity or the more cognitive effort you're putting in, the better you do, and over the course of the whole task in 3 minutes. And that is very different than what we see with the futility response, which is effectively the opposite. So that was really interesting because we don't see a lot of interventions that do that for people. And so the summary of the results that we had were that TVS significantly reduced subjective signs of stress, TVS selectively improved performance on a stressful cognitive task, and TVS induced a linear relationship between cognitive effort and performance under stress. So some of the next steps that we are working on is that since we actually starting before we did the study, we had to raise funding to do the study. And so since 2016, our team has raised over $235,000 in funding from the University of Pittsburgh to fund work in Dr. Siegle's lab on this topic. And our ongoing studies that are the continuation of this work are that we now know we can boost heart rate variability and improve the signs of parasympathetic tone, decrease sympathetic tone, improve emotion regulation, and improve performance under stress. Who suffers from difficulties performing under stress more than anybody else? From the literature right now, PTSD kind of stands out. And so we actually were funded $125,000 in November of this year to do a combination lab study and real-world study of 100 folks with PTSD, at least half of which will be military veterans, where we're going to bring them into the lab and repeat a very similar protocol that we did here, and then we're actually going to send them home with wearable hardware that I actually have a couple of. If anybody would like to try, come up afterwards. And we're going to send them home with these devices and actually see, can we change the way that people are functioning in the real world? Can we reduce medication burden? Can we reduce PTSD symptoms? Can we help people live better in their day-to-day lives and not just in a lab? And then can we also collect objective metrics at the same time? And then we're also doing a meditation study that Dr. Shan Gao is pioneering in Dr. Siegle's lab, and that's now actively running, where we're assessing. We found that, from the theory slide that I posed earlier, vibration stimulation has huge targets in lamina 1, and then lamina 1 goes relatively directly to the amygdala and the anterior insular cortex. And one of the things that's most interesting about the insular cortex is that it's responsible for interoception, how we feel our bodies, our awareness of our own bodies. It's responsible for introspection, looking inside yourself, and empathy. And so when we gave people some of these frequencies, these vibration TVS frequencies early on, we found that people said that they were feeling more aware of their bodies, and they were feeling more, they were able to pay more attention to their emotions and able to walk through more difficult situations more easily, which is really fascinating to us. And so we decided, after playing with a few meditators, that, why not do a meditation study and see if we can actually augment mindfulness and meditation in a reliable and predictable way. And so that study's going on now, and we were just funded $70,000 by Pitt to do a study of Pitt athletes to test whether we can enhance recovery and performance in athletes. I think we're focusing on the football team. So future goals long-term are to develop wearables and software so that someone can use TVS easily at home, which is where the PTSD study is starting. And then reactive stimulation with biometric sensors. So effectively, what that means is that if we can reliably change your heart rate variability, your heart rate, your respirations, or your sweat, or any other biometrics that we can measure remotely, then we can also stimulate your body in response to that in a customized way that is personalized to you. So if we know that your body, after doing a calibration with our frequencies, that your body, you like to feel a certain way at a certain time, and there's certain frequencies help get you there. When you're stressed out or you're angry, the body expresses signs of stress earlier than we're typically cognitively aware. You start sweating earlier, you get piloerection, your heart starts beating faster, your breathing changes. We can actually detect that early, learn about what stresses you out, what situations get you into stressful situations where you might make poor decisions, yell at somebody when you shouldn't, not function at your best, and then we can actually take that information, process it in real time in an algorithm, and then send it to the device, turn it on to predictively regulate you, or help you predictively regulate yourself better before you actually get into the stressful situation. So for folks with mental illness, that's like PTSD, depression, anxiety, people who have chronic pain, people who have incredible autism, for instance, who have incredible difficulty regulating their emotional states, this could be a really life-changing technology for them. So this was a huge team effort, and I just want to thank everybody on the team who helped with this project. This is the core of the Motion Prosthetics team. Dr. Greg Siegle and everyone in the Pecan lab, Catherine Fantazzi, who has been a consultant since early on, helping us to raise funding for all this work, Dr. Shan Gao, Dr. Eric Loras, and Noah Friedman, who helped us with a lot of the programming development of our lab software. So because this was such a team effort, and we clearly couldn't have done it without the team, I thought, of talking with Greg, that it was important to put in a slide about how important multifunctional collaborative team science is. Because without this, we would never have been able to do any of this work. And I think it's really important to note that the average time from research studies to implementation in the clinic, so when you have a result from a research study to the time where that result actually changes practice in mental health, is 17 years. That is a really long time, and we need to change that. And so the way that we can change that is with these multidisciplinary collaborative teams, because with teams that have people from lots of different areas of expertise, we can solve complex problems really quickly by tapping into different perspectives. We can innovate and pivot more quickly. We can integrate with current systems more effectively because we can bring on folks and work with folks that have expertise in those systems and how they work and how to integrate. And then we can also implement change in practice based on results more effectively by working with large diverse groups of experts. And so I wanted to thank everybody who has helped out with this work. Dr. Greg Siegle has been an incredible mentor and advisor and PI, and I am so grateful for the opportunity to work in his lab since I was a fourth-year med student. And actually, special thanks I forgot to mention to Dr. Rosenstock for setting me up with Greg, because when I was a med student, I was first doing a fellowship, in a Detry fellowship here, when I had no idea who I was going to work with, and I emailed Dr. Rosenstock and I said, this is what I'm interested in, can you set me up with somebody? And Greg was the first person on the list, and it was I really am grateful for that. Thank you to Kim Young, who's joining us as a last-minute expert for this presentation, and then the Motion Prosthetics team again, and Lorenzo Saletti, who is one of the first entrepreneurs in residence who was working with us to guide our commercial development. The software team who developed our mobile technology that we're using in the study, Ray Pelletier, Blaise Clare, and Sam Waters, the Pecan Lab, Marley, Tony, Rebecca, Haley, Scott, and Noah, and all of our funders who made this possible. And questions? Greg and Kim, do you want to come up? First off, before we get to these questions, are there any questions for anyone in the audience about the work?
So fascinating, really intriguing. I'd be curious to know, so do you think it's definitely due to the vibration in particular, or could it be just any kind of created sensation? I was just thinking about that because as you were talking about it, we have a randomized controlled trial intervention, mindfulness-based with autism. And one of the things we focus on is using like sensation-focused distraction, and they find it very useful. But if they created themselves stuff, they feel this, you don't have to know when to do it yourself. Right. But I was curious, I wonder if you find a similar thing if you did that design using their own created sensation-focused distraction, like squeezing your legs really hard, putting like the soft side of the pen in your fingernail.
Yes, I think that's a great question. Those interventions have been around for a very long time, and they work. And I mentioned some of them earlier, like therapeutic touch, for instance, is very helpful. Therapeutic music and meditation, deep breathing, all these things. But the issue with those interventions is that they don't work in the moment, and they require effort and practice. And so if you're somebody who is not aware of your emotional state, then it becomes very difficult to use those techniques in real time. And so the goal of this was to tap into the same mechanisms that are creating the positive effect that you see with those strategies, without actually requiring any effort on the part of the user, by having the technology learn about each individual user and customize predictively for that user. Did you want to?
Yeah, I'll just add one other thing, which is, what you're suggesting is a really important idea, that we don't need to rely on technology for everything. I would suggest that we look at this data Dave presented showing that different frequencies have different effects. So if it's just any stimulus, then we would expect pretty much all of the frequencies we use to have the same effect. I think there probably is some level of common variance among, you're doing something to the system to take your mind off your ruminations, but also there might be something specific about certain frequencies that are giving us this differentiation.
And I think the last thing just to add on to that is that we are purposefully in this study and with this technology, we're purposefully not trying to distract the user. distraction, avoidance, numbing, shutting down. All of these things are coping strategies that we use every day, and we're pretty darn good at them. What we want to do is we want to help you reach a state of Buddha mastery on your own, where you can effectively be calm in the face of stress without distraction. So your mind is not deviating to, oh, now I have to pinch myself to regulate. But I can still focus on what I'm doing and still be calm and be functional. Gil?
Yeah, so I thought one of the slides that was really interesting to me was the different frequencies and the control. We had this reduction in some very low level of stress. And it kind of comes back conceptually. I'm wondering what you think that might mean, and whether it's this time-old like inverted U kind of phenomenon. You need like some optimal level of stress to then improve performance, but you don't want to damp down too much, and you don't want to ramp up too much. Is that along the lines of what you're thinking, and how do you improve?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. I think we know that acute stressors can be good, right? We need certain levels of acute stress to be productive, to help with survival, to help us take care of these day-to-day things we have to do, and to give us some get up and go. At the same time, that stress times time is chronic stress. Chronic stress resulting in practice negative intrusive thinking, rumination, conditioning of the autonomic nervous system to be hypersympathetic. All of those things are what impair performance and increases the rates of poor coping, poor emotion regulation, frustration, futility, all those kinds of things. So I think what we're really trying to highlight is that there's a distinct difference between those two. There is an optimal stress state, which is a lot to talk about, I think, in this setting. But basically, what our results are hinting at is that there is an optimal state of arousal and calm. So an autonomic activity, and where you have some parasympathetic activity and some sympathetic activity, and those two together facilitate optimal work, optimal flow, optimal, in the zone productivity. And you're a little stressed, but you're going with it, and it's okay. You're present. I think, Greg, do you have a better way to explain that?
I don't have a better explanation as much as to say this is an awesome question that we are actually interested in. So in the current study, the new one, the PTSD study, we're giving this need for arousal scale, which gets at these individual differences in how much arousal is useful for you to optimize performance. And we're looking at whether stress decreases performance, increases as a function of quote unquote need for arousal.
So, hi there. I have a question based on this individual difference idea that we just talked about. So I presume, and I'm also interested in the practical applications of this. So I presume, or maybe you can tell me your plans for individualizing, for lack of a better word, the dose of the vibration.
Yeah.
How you handle escalation of the dose if needed, and what you do about habituation.
Great. Fantastic questions. What we're looking at here is, in the real world, how people use this. We give them an app where you can turn it on when you want, turn it off when you want, and actually increase the intensity or decrease the intensity at any given time. And we're going to see how people end up dosing themselves. Near as we can tell, this thing doesn't have side effects. I won't say that. There are a few people for whom they've achieved kind of spacey states when they use this for prolonged periods, and we'll let on about that. But in general, it's not like it has a very strong side effect profile, so we're pretty comfortable giving people the reins to say, use it when you want, as much as you want. We'll track that. We're tracking their physiology in the real world, and we're tracking also some variables that really should give us a sense of how stressed they are, how loud they're speaking, and how fast they're speaking, and how high-pitched, which is together, if you start speaking loud and high-pitched and fast, kind of likely means you're stressed, and we're going to look at whether use of this thing and what doses end up helping people. So I don't want to go in and say I know that in advance, but that's what a PTSD study is to figure out.
I think just to answer your question about tolerance, we haven't really seen it, which is really interesting. And that kind of speaks to where this comes from, which is the meditation, the biofeedback, the mindfulness literature. When you first start meditating, it's tricky, it takes a lot of focus and attention, and it's not necessarily that easy to do, and it might take you a long time to get to these meditative states of calm and heightened parasympathetic tone. However, as you practice meditating, you access those states more quickly, and it becomes something that is more fluid with your normal state. And so what we've seen so far with folks who have been using this in their day-to-day is that they get that effect. So it seems like we're almost training. We don't have the study to support that yet, but it seems like from the initial preliminary results that people tend to have effects happen more quickly the more they use it, and those effects are more potent. So people...
So you've tried this on a few people, the actual wearable?
Yeah, Dave and I have them on. And
What about people that aren't invested in this? Will they keep it on and keep using it?
that's what the PTSD study is looking at. That is, it's a feasibility study to say, will people use this over a month?
Right.
Catherine's company has been giving this thing out to people to try. And, the word from her is that people seem to like it.
Are you going to let kids use it when they take the SATs?
I think that's actually the SAT.
So right. So this is actually this interesting question of, wearable performance enhancements. Where is that going to fit into our society? And we started to get into that here because the ethical questions end up actually being large, right? If the people who can afford it can afford stress reduction and the people who can't afford it can't, that would be bad. So like one of the early considerations, my lab sat around and actually tried to go through a lot of the ethical stuff. And you saw one of our sponsors was the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Studies, where I spent a sabbatical last year working on this, which ended up being mostly about ethics. And the ethics of wearables and the ethics not only of measurement, but who do you give them to and when and how? And one of the things we came up with is keep this thing at a really low price point so that anybody who wants can get access to it. We didn't want something that only the rich can use. Get something that is unlikely to be iatrogenic. We don't want people dependent on it. And so we've been looking at that. And one of the things I found that was kind of interesting in that way is, for me, I'm somebody who doesn't tend to relax a lot in the face of stress. Who knew? Right? With this, it pairs a more relaxed response with my stress response, and I tend to start to learn that. And then, so after using it for a week or two, I can go a few days sort of without using it and have that sort of more relaxed response. But then I sort of come back to my usual self and I need it again. What I would suggest is that's the opposite of an iatrogenic response. So we're going through these things and trying to, dot our I's to make this something that could be disseminated.
Sure, you answered some of the practical questions, but at the conceptual level, how do you think this compares to vagal nerve stimulation and also the question about habituation? Because in some cases, that's been shown to habituate after 3 or 4 months.
Right. So this is really interesting. Did you want to? Okay, so the vagal nerve stuff is really cool. If the only mechanism was parasympathetic tone, I would say just give everybody a vagal nerve implant who could get it. Or, of course, people don't want to have surgery all the time. Other people have been looking at electricity for that. Catherine actually did a bunch of market research. We started as an electricity team looking at vagal stimulation. And Catherine does this market research that said people do not want on-demand electricity, or specifically, your boss is yelling at you, and if you start twitching because you're getting stimulated, that would be bad. So we tried to have something a little kindler and gentler, and that's where we came up with the vibration. But the other thing I would say is, near as we can tell, it's not just the parasympathetic tone bump that is doing this. This idea that we are creating linearity between effort and performance. And you can take that graph that Dave showed with pupil dilation on the x-axis and performance on the y-axis and say the more brain you put into something, the more you seem to get out of it. Wearing this, I don't think that's consistent with necessarily just increasing parasympathetic tone. It's actually consistent with outsourcing some of the regulatory controls so that you can think in ways you want to. And I haven't seen that kind of result from the vagal stimulation. As to the habituation over months, quite frankly, we just haven't tried this for months with people yet. That's the PTSD study, so we'll get that data for you, but right now we have a 2-hour lab study to bank on.
You want to? I'm a little confused about the degree to which what you're talking about.
Could you speak up a little bit? I'm sorry.
Sorry?
Could you speak up a little bit?
Oh, sure. I say I'm a little confused about to what extent does this program of research that you have developed depend on, require anchoring in a clinical population? In other words, are you not really tinkering with and being able to influence productively performance generically? And so the question is, what are the long-term broad implications of a program of research like that that can be applied in the military, can be applied in business, for learning purposes, not solving problems of stress or whatever, but just simply manipulating the autonomic nervous system, the intake of information to the interest of the person, and essentially turn them off and turn them free in society to advance its efforts. So you're talking about something that, if you take it out of the psychopathology realm and apply it generically, has huge moral, ethical, historical implications.
So I guess the best way to answer that is that's the goal. We would like to change, ideally, the way that we look at the body and the balance of mind and body and performance. I think just to re-emphasize, this is not making you a robot remote control. This is enhancing your ability to regulate your own emotions more effectively and to enter and adapt to different changes in stress in your environment and internally generated stress more effectively. With respect to the other question you answered, Catherine, with the company, has already had market interest from athletes, elite professional athletes, the Penguins being one team, military, elite special forces, and what they're all interested in this for, contrary to what many people might think, is actually recovery and preventing PTSD. So not the athletes are recovery and enhancing sleep, but military is for recovery, enhancing sleep, and preventing PTSD, because what happens is these guys go off into service and they are chronically in a stressed out hypersympathetic state, and that's where they're used to being. But when they come back to civilian life, they struggle to reintegrate because they're not used to this. They're not used to being in the line at Walmart, and that's where they lose it. And so if we could give them something to help calm them down, to reintegrate, to make better decisions, if we could help decrease that suicide rate by 10%, that would be, a godsend for those people. And so that's really, what we're hoping this will do. And with respect to, businesses and, I think we're not, it's not going that route right now because we want this to be used for good. And so that's what we're really focusing on, is how can we help people recover and be their best when they want to be, and with a focus of mental illness. But you're right, there are a lot of extensive implications societally that Greg mentioned earlier that we are looking into.
Yeah, so just to sort of give a sense, we have this team where Dave really has taken on the mantle of the psychopathology part of this work, and Shen, who's in the back, has actually taken on the mantle of improving people's everyday lives and helping people perform to capacity in their everyday lives. So Shen's actually the PI on this meditation study where we're taking healthy people who just would like to meditate and be able to do that a little bit more strongly, whatever that means for them, and saying, can we augment their meditative experience with vibration? And then we've got this athletics grant where we're working with Pitt athletics teams to say, can we increase the speed with which they recover from being out on the field doing something when they come back and wait a little bit before they have to go back out on the field again. So yeah, we're working with all those, and I think you're right. It has huge society and ethical implications. I would also say we're not the first to enter these waters. And you could point to places like Halo Neuroscience that are also doing it, these like wearable brain stimulation things. And there are a bunch of products out there now. But if you say that everybody now is into nootropics, you know, everybody takes some vitamin, a third of the population is on some psychopharmacology, whether they need it or not, it's, I think we're in the sweet spot of what society thinks it's doing, which is changing how we process information on a daily basis.
I think we have only a minute left. Kim, do you want to share? Do you want to share? If there's anything about that, it can be about any of these questions too. Why wearables?
Yeah, so as someone who is not, I'm part of the lab, I work on neurofeedback, I'm not involved in this project other than just hearing updates about it. And I tried the device, and as I was telling Dave, I tried it at a conference, and the next day I was on a plane, and there was really bad turbulence, and I kept thinking, I really wish I had stole that device and had it with me, because I could, even in the brief 20-minute time period that I was wearing it, I could feel how effective it was. And I think this move towards technology and self-efficacy, kind of not having somebody do something for you, but having your body or being in control or teaching how to control your body yourself is what is really important for the future of psychiatry, for the future of treatment.
I hate to do this, but I have to ask this question. What do you have in mind for addressing the placebo effect?
That is a great question.
So again, the lovely thing here is that we have some frequencies that seem to work and some frequencies that don't seem to work, and we can give people both and not tell people which, and we can do it so we're blinded too.
Other question, little stuff for you. I, as you know, do TBI research, and I am thinking that with those pit football players, what you're describing is a lot of what happens after a concussion of various severity. And I'm wondering if this little gadget will be something you can prescribe to somebody after a concussion that will accelerate their recovery. Because so much of concussion to me seems to take on a life of its own.
Stress about the concussion.
Give them something to depend on for that first 3 months and really get them better. It might be worth prescribing.
That'd be extraordinary. That'd be extraordinary if that happened to work, yeah. And if you want to talk to us about applications of it, we are right now open for collaboration, so.
Thank you so much for coming.